Hello, football fans, and welcome back to the campus of the University of Toronto under the bubble. In downtown Toronto, the core of Bloor in Devonshire, we are back for more 40s here at the 2016 CFL Combine presented by Adidas. Running backs and linebackers taking their positions at the starting line, and we'll start it off with Devon Stewart out of McGill University. In his hometown, St. Hubert, Quebec, his first run out of the blocks nicely through the finish line, and we'll wait just a couple of seconds until we get his results for his first sprint. He bench pressed 27 reps yesterday. His vertical jump was 24.5 inches. We do seem to be having some technical difficulties once again with the computerized system that gives us our results. So I do not see a result for Devon Stewart. Next out of the blocks is Donald Tabor, who came through the Montreal Regional. A native of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and St. FX X-Man, who bench pressed 20 yesterday, his vertical jump of 28 inches. Again, I'd love to give you the numbers right now, folks, but unfortunately some technical difficulties, and we are having to reboot the system. Again, all of the results, though, will be online at CFL.ca. And we hope to get this figured out for you as soon as we possibly can, but failing that, make sure you're checking the Combine leaderboard at CFL.ca and getting social as well with the CFL on Twitter. Number 32, Wayne Moore, running back out of McMaster University, and his hometown is Etobicoke, Ontario. A vertical jump on Saturday of 29 inches, and his bench press rep numbers 19. Wayne Moore rushing 108 times for 565 yards and 3 touchdowns in 2015, and he's away. And we'll be joined by Dwayne Ford of TSN in the next few minutes as well. We'll get his insight into the Combine, insight into this event, and all of the rest of them, including the vaunted one-on-one drills, which we've just seen a little earlier this morning, offensive linemen and defensive linemen taking each other on. He's stepping into the starting area now is the man who's 7th on the CFL Scouting Bureau December rankings list, down a couple of notches from the fall where he was ranked number 5. That's Mercer Timmis, the Calgary Dino from Burlington, Ontario, a CIS All-Canadian, 3 seasons in a row, 2013, 14, and 15. Mercer Timmis through with his first attempt. Again, everybody will get 2 attempts. They'll circulate through once again. Timmis, 8 reps of 225 pounds on the bench press on Saturday, and his vertical jump was 33.5 inches. Now, those of you who are just tuning into our live stream, I'd just like to say we are having some computer difficulties right now in getting these times. We'll get it fixed up as soon as we possibly can. Nathan O'Halloran, out of the University of Windsor and a native of Amherstburg, Ontario, is now at the starting line, and he's off. And as he gets to the finish line, I'd like to welcome Dwayne Ford from TSN. How are you, Dwayne? It's nice to see you this morning.
Oh, thanks, man. I'm sorry to keep you waiting over here, but I was just waiting for one of the fullbacks to come up. Nathan O'Halloran being one of those guys. You know.
Yeah.
I'm not into the speed guys. I want the blood and guts guys.
The guys that count, right?
That's right. You know it. Yeah, no, Nathan's a guy that earned his way in here through the Toronto Regional Combine. He was a guy that I'm a little bit surprised actually wasn't on the original invite list. Had competed well at the East-West Bowl. And, converted linebacker. Actually started his career at Wilfrid Laurier. Went back home to Windsor. Flipped over to the offensive side of the ball, and I think has found himself a home there.
Running backs and linebackers basically coming through here, but you'll see some crossover as we did this morning. when we had a linebacker running with the offensive lineman and the defensive lineman, and now we've got Félix Faubert-Lucier from Laval coming through.
And Faubert-Lucier, although he's listed, as you said, with the receiver group, is a guy who's played that hybrid, almost H-back position in the Laval offense. Familiar name, I guess, for a lot of people would be Patrick Lavoie, now with the Ottawa Red Blacks, is a guy who played a similar spot, or going back in time. Michel Pierre-Pontbriand, now with Winnipeg, are guys that have played the same position within that Laval offense. But Faubert-Lucier was Laval's leading receiver last year, so strong guy who can handle the blocking, but also a very capable receiver from that spot as well.
We're circulating through. We'll get to the linebackers in just a moment. But now it's second attempts for the running backs and for Faubert-Lucier as well. And getting back into the blocks is Devon Stewart, again out of McGill University.
And Stewart's another one who will be evaluated primarily as a fullback, as CFL rosters have become a little bit bigger over the last decade or so. A little bit more room for the specialized guys, who are primarily one position guys. So more room for the fullbacks, where we had seen my guys as a bit of a dying breed. Bit of a dying breed as the league has gone to more 5 and 6 receiver offenses. And I think the result has been that a lot of times when you look at the CIS schools following suit in terms of the schemes they run, if you're only going to have a guy who's a really good 225, 230-pound athlete, if you're only going to get him on the field for 10 plays on offense, you're going to move him somewhere else where you can get the most out of that ability. And so you're seeing a lot of those guys in CIS playing linebacker, playing defensive end, and as a result, not as many fullbacks available come draft time. But now you're slowly, I think, starting to see a little bit of a shift back, and it's creating an opportunity for guys like O'Halloran and Devon Stewart.
And Devon Stewart, his second attempt, 4.917. We seem to have gotten the system back up. Sorry, that's Donald Tabor. We get the system back up just in time for Donald Tabor, who just ran his attempt at 4.917. 4.917 for Tabor. Now Wayne Moore out of McMaster University stepping in for his second attempt.
And Wayne Moore, a local product, Toronto guy. Good career at McMaster, where obviously the run game has been a big part of what they have done. Participated in a Vanier Cup here in 2012 with the Marauders.
I guess the classic question, Dwayne, I'll ask it of you, is just how important is the 40? We've heard from some football people who just say, it's a little indicator, especially maybe the first 10 yards, explosiveness in that, but there aren't an awful lot of patterns that you're going to run as a running back or a receiver that just take you straight, or as a defensive back, you're certainly not charging just 40 yards down the field.
Yeah, and I look at it the same way, really, that I look at the testing in general, is that it's, as you said, an indicator, general indicator of general athletic ability, athletic potential as a whole. I mean, I always joke that I'd like to see the test where it's not how fast can you run 40 yards in a straight line with nobody in front of you, but how fast are you willing to run when there's a 225-pound linebacker standing in front of you.
And how maybe that's something for down the road. We do one-on-ones on Sundays. How about you get from this point to that point? It's 40 yards down the field as fast as you can, and this guy's going to try and stop you.
That's right. How much of a hurry? How much of a hurry are you in to get there when somebody's waiting for you?
What's your personal best time in the 40?
I'll tell the story as I can see Bob Obilovich sitting across from me here, and OB was my coach in Toronto in the mid-'90s. I remember arriving at Argos training camp in 1994, and OB was one of the scouts who had been there when I ran my 40 at the Combine 3 years earlier. And, as I stepped up to run my 40, he said, are you going to break 5 seconds today? I nodded. I said, of course. I think I ran a 4.99 that day. I once got into the 4.7s in college, but, admittedly, I may have taken a bit of a rolling start on that one.
All right, I think the computer is a little bit jammed up again. We've still got Tabor's result there, but we don't have the second one for Wayne Moore right now, unfortunately. Maybe we should just get our smartphones out. This is the two of us, and we'll just hit the stopwatch app, and we'll time them out that way. Here's Mercer Timmis with his second run. His first was a 4.734. I can tell you that much, and hopefully we'll get his second run up here as well.
Mercer Timmis from nearby Burlington, Ontario. I'd label it as one of Blake Nill's great recruiting coups, getting Mercer Timmis and Brett Blasco out of Burlington, Ontario to go all the way to Calgary in a year right after McMaster had won a Vanier Cup. But, Timmis, a perennial Heck Crichton contender with the Calgary Dinos, a guy who's often drawn comparisons to another Burlington native, Jesse Lumsden, in terms of his style, physical, his size, and so on, taller running back.
Sorry, Dwayne, I just wanted to say his time was 4.703. 4.703 for Timmis, and then we just got to look at Nathan O'Halloran blurring by us on his second attempt, and it's a 5.06. 5.06.
Again, O'Halloran's a guy who's not going to earn his way onto a roster with his speed, but he's one of those guys, as I talk about, running a 40-yard dash where you got to run into somebody. He might actually run faster if he knew there was going to be some contact at the end.
Felix Faubert-Lussier back into the starting area. 4.663 was his first time, and he had a great Saturday, Dwayne. Tied for 5th overall on the vertical, 34.5 inches, and 26 reps of 225 pounds. That was tops among receivers.
Yeah, and obviously a very athletic guy, and you can see when you often you look at tests like the bench press and the vertical jump as these drastically different things. But you can see the versatility when you look at his success in both of those tests, and he's currently our leader in the 40-yard dash. That you can see where he's a guy who could play that hybrid position very well, a combination of strength to be a blocker, but also the speed to be a receiver.
He took his 4.663 and bettered it. As you said, he's the leader now with a better time, 4.58 on his second attempt. Felix Faubert-Lussier out of Laval.
And part of the benefit that you get from a guy who has that kind of versatility and can play that position is, again, going back to the bigger rosters, and as defenses become more specialized and want to make substitutions based on offensive formation or offensive personnel, you've got a guy like that from whom you can run your two-back sets with him at fullback, but then you can also line him up as a slot.
Right.
And if your running back's a good receiver as well, you can empty out the backfield and run routes, and the defense has no idea whether they should be substituting in linebackers to play against a two-back set or whether they want to go with more defensive backs to cover the pass. And so a great option to have in terms of what he offers you offensively.
It's funny how things change, and they take years and years and years to change. I remember as a kid, you just had your 3 basic big linebackers, once in a while 4, and there, teams leaned on the running game, and then, and I'm talking 30 or 40 years ago, you would get mismatches against linebackers with receivers, and then finally they started to go to more of a hybrid guy, a defensive back who was converted, who could do some cover, and now we see it on every CFL team.
Yeah,
because you have to be able to cover that empty backfield guy.
Yeah, absolutely, and it was, I curse the guys that I had as coaches in Calgary, and Wally Bono was our head coach, John Huffnagel was our offensive coordinator, but they're the guys who really pioneered a lot of the change. John Huffnagel was the first guy to start consistently using 5 receiver offenses, and maybe it was just because he didn't want me on the field at fullback. I'm not sure, but he was one of the guys that started that. And then, as well on the defensive side of the ball, Calgary was really one of the first teams with Darryl Hall, who was a defensive halfback by trade, who moved him into an outside linebacker spot and gave you a very good cover guy as an outside linebacker to cope with what teams were doing offensively, getting an extra receiver on the field.
Well, we're into the linebackers now, and we saw Kevin Jackson just a second ago. 4.825 was his time on his first attempt. Marc-Antoine Laurent now with his first attempt out of the University of Ottawa, his hometown Cantley, Quebec. And we'll get a look at his first number here as well.
Both Jackson and Laurent, guys who qualified for the National Combine through the regionals. Laurent participating in that Montreal Combine, from which 4 players advanced. Kevin Jackson played at Sam Houston State, grew up in Texas, but has his Canadian citizenship and thus qualifies as a national. The guy who looked very, very good here in Toronto on Thursday.
Now Terrell Davis is lining up for his first attempt, as we still await Marc-Antoine Laurent's numbers on his first sprint. We'll try to get those to you as soon as we possibly can. Terrell Davis, one of Justin Dunk's under-the-radar prospects this weekend.
I'll have to give Justin a hard time about that one. I'm not sure if we can call a guy who led the Vanier Cup champions in tackles under the radar. But Davis, a guy who left the country in 2012 out of Mount Douglas High School in Victoria, BC, was one of the most heavily recruited running backs in the country. He and Akeel Lynch, who ended up at Penn State. But Davis went down to Arizona State, spent a couple years down there as a running back, decided to come back home to UBC, spent his first year as a running back sharing the backfield with Brandon Deschamps, who was at the Combine here a couple years ago, and then this year moved over to defense in a pretty seamless transition, as he was part of a pretty big impact trio that was new on that defense with Taylor Loeffler, who's also here at the Combine, who had transferred from Boise State, Mitchell Barnett, who had transferred from Simon Fraser, participated in the Edmonton Combine. All three of those guys, a big part of that Vanier Cup championship team.
We just saw Shane Gauthier out of Laval, the two-time Vanier Cup champion, get across the line in 4.681 seconds. 4.681 was the time for Shane Gauthier.
Gauthier, part of that Laval quintet that impressed yesterday. 5 Laval players here, all with 22-plus reps in the bench press. And just a reminder that the Rouge et Or, they don't win by accident.
No.
Their preparation is flawless.
Curtis Newton, out of the University of Guelph, the Griffin, and hometown of London, Ontario. Vertical of 25.5 inches yesterday. His rep numbers 16 on the bench press, and his 40 time is 5.057. 5.057 for Curtis Newton.
Yeah, and Curtis Newton's a guy who's been very productive in that Guelph linebacking core. He, along with John Rush, keys to that team's defense and the resurgence of the Griffins. They beat my Mustangs last year.
Here comes Doug Parrish out of Western Oregon University, the native of Edmonton, Alberta, whose father played in the Canadian Football League, Doug Parrish Sr. You might remember that name. Played with the Edmonton Eskimos. Doug Parrish Jr.'s numbers, first attempt, 4.856. That's a 4.856 for Parrish.
And Doug Jr. grew up primarily in the U.S., but again, Canadian citizen by birth, born in Edmonton during his dad's time there. Started his college career actually as a defensive back at San Jose State and spent his first few years there before transferring to Western Oregon.
DJ Lalama now came through the Edmonton Regionals to appear at this event this weekend. University of Manitoba Bison, and a native of Winnipeg, Manitoba, into the starting line now and getting ready for his sprint.
And DJ's a guy, although from Winnipeg, actually started his college career at Western. Transferred back to Manitoba after years, had a very, very good career there under Brian Doby. As you can see, DJ's a guy who's worked very hard over the last several years, very focused young man.
4.818 his time.
In these 40 times, as we were talking earlier about the relative importance, I know for the linebackers, really one of the big things that separates the guys that are capable, Canadian players who are capable of playing linebacker in the CFL as opposed to being strictly special teamers, is that foot speed. A lot of times you have guys who are very productive CFL or CIS linebackers, but just don't have the speed in the Canadian Football League game, where you're going to be dealing with some pretty quick backs in terms of coverage and so on. And so I would say for these guys, a lot of times this is where people will kind of look and decide whether a guy's got a chance athletically.
Here's a guy who spent last season with the Calgary Colts of the CJFL and 3 seasons prior to that with the University of Calgary, Alex Ogbong Bamiga, the linebacker born in Lagos, Nigeria, with a 34-inch vertical at the Edmonton Regional and bench pressed 16. And we'll wait for his time to appear on the computer screen. 5.052 for Ogbong Bamiga. 5.052.
Alex is a guy who actually started his college career at the University of Houston and ended up, as his family was living in Texas at the time, and when the family moved to Calgary, he moved with them and transferred to the U of C. So another little bit of a find for Blake Nill during his time at Calgary. Actually, Alex's younger brother, Amin Ogbog-Bamiga, is one of the top recruits in the Canadian class of 2016, has committed to Oklahoma State University for next season.
I am absolutely amazed. Dwayne Ford has 0 notes, folks. I mean, I'm loaded down here, of course, looking down at things that are highlighted. This is all off the top of his head. I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that, as Kevin Jackson with his second attempt false starts, and he'll go back to the line. But it's amazing. Just how do you do that? Is it just year after year, another player gets added to the file up there?
Yeah, I guess it's something like that. For me, I try to stay a little bit ahead of the curve, and that a lot of the guys I'll try to follow. Not even so much just when they get into their draft year, but if I'm really on, so to speak, I'll kind of start tracking guys in high school as much as I can as they get towards the end of high school, and yeah.
So I guess the next step is you'll start tracking them when they're about 8 or 9.
That's right. That's right. Like the old Russian system.
Yeah, exactly.
So, start directing them into sports at a young age based on their genetic potential.
Kevin Jackson lining up again, and he came through the Toronto Regional. At this point in time, I'd like to point out, I think it was 2012, and I remember your invitational combine. There was just this national combine, and a guy by the name of Mike Filer came out of it. He was the first to do that. He impressed well at nationals, got drafted by the Calgary Stampeders, and now a starting center with the Hamilton Ticats. So I think a lot of these guys, 17 men have been invited to this national through the regionals, and I think they have you to thank in part for really shining a spotlight on. There's a lot of talent out here that's not necessarily getting invited, and we should look at it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll tell you, I mean, the history with the old National Invitational Combine was, a good friend of mine, Mike Guff, who runs Athletic Edge Combine training down in Florida. But Mike is a Toronto guy, and he and I had first met about 20 years ago, mid-'90s, when I was involved doing a training program with a bunch of guys, a bunch of CFL players, and Mike had just graduated from Concordia University and was interested in becoming a trainer. And so he was one of the guys that worked with us on that speed program and has since grown his business to where he's now, I mean, he preps guys for the CFL draft down there, but also preps a number of NFL guys for the Combine, trains a number of players there during the offseason and so on. Victor Cruz, former Giants receiver, would be one of the big names that Mike has worked with, one of the guys that kind of put him on the map. But Mike and I got talking about the need, about the fact that with the CFL inviting about 50 guys to the main Combine every year, that the fact was there was a need for more players to be seen, and even for the teams, there was a need for them to see more guys. But just in terms of resources, both of a human nature and financially, it was difficult. Like, it's not like the States where all the schools, it wasn't worth it for all the schools to have pro days because they didn't have that many prospects. But the thought was, well, what if we could get as many prospects as possible, and legitimate prospects? And that's why we made it an invitational thing as opposed to just a free agent walk-on thing. But if we could get as many prospects as possible in one place, and logically if we could do it around the same time as this main Combine, then all the teams would be in town, and the only added cost for them wouldn't be in terms of travel, but it would just be in terms of basically an extra night in a hotel. And so we used to run it on the Friday before the main Combine. First year it was a huge success. Out of 47 players picked in the CFL draft, 7 of them were guys that had been to the National Invitational Combine, and it sort of, I guess, confirmed not only what we thought needed to happen, but I think for a lot of the teams, the teams and the league obviously saw the value in that. And within a couple of years, we had talked with the league about doing the regionals, and for us as 2 guys running it, it wasn't realistic for us to travel around the country doing regionals. But the league, given its resources and so on, was able to do that, and so that kind of led to the birth of the regional combines and so on. And obviously now you've got players advancing from the regionals to the main Combine, and and hopefully, I don't want to say a more deserving group, because I think it's always been a deserving group that has been at the National Combine, but more deserving prospects getting an opportunity to have this experience and opportunity.
And we've seen some great performances from those who've been invited through regionals over the years and then getting drafted. 4 players who came through regionals getting drafted into the CFL last year. As we were chatting, Shane Gauthier, who had been leading amongst the linebackers with a 4.681, his second attempt was even better at 4.667. Felix Faubert-Lucier still at the top of the leaderboard, of course, a wide receiver running with the linebackers with a 4.58 so far, and we're going through our second attempts now.
And again, as you take a look at the guys at the top of this, much like I mentioned with the Laval guys in the bench press yesterday, I mean, you've got 2 Laval players atop the leaderboard here in the 40-yard dash. And, I mean, people can say whatever they want about the facilities and so on that they have at Laval, that they may have an advantage in that regard. But none of that means anything if the players aren't using those things and taking advantage of them. And obviously these guys are, and making the most of it in terms of their preparation. I mean, we saw the offensive line group with 3 guys that are outstanding. We've seen 3 Laval offensive linemen drafted in the first round of the draft over the last 2 years. You've got 3 guys in Gagnon, Vaillancourt, and Lauzon-Séguin who are potential first-rounders in this draft, and that's without even getting into Faubert-Lucier and Gauthier, who obviously are very legitimate prospects as well. So, I mean, kudos to Glenn Constantin and everything he has done with that Laval program, not just within the confines of CIS football, but in terms of developing players for the CFL.
DJ Lalama just burst through with his second attempt at 4.857. His first was at 4.818, so just a slight bit slower. And now here comes Alex Ogbong-Bemiga again, 5.052 in his first attempt.
Again, Alex spent a little bit of time at University of Calgary, but has played junior football over the last couple of seasons. And that's another place where I think the regional combines can really help out, is a lot of times you'll have guys who get on the draft list because they started their collegiate career or started their post-secondary career at the college level, whether CIS or in the States, and for whatever reason, you know, sometimes guys would sort of get forgotten. Their names remain on the draft list, but once they go and play junior football, there's even less of a spotlight than there is on the CIS, and sometimes those guys kind of fall off the radar. But I think the regional combines really give some of those guys an opportunity to get back in front of CFL scouts.
Ogbong-Bemiga will be very happy with his second attempt because he did break 5 seconds with it, 4.938. That's 4.938 for the man from Lagos, Nigeria. As we burst through another group, we get the 40s done, and the day marches on. And our next group coming up a little later on today, of course, we'll have some defensive backs and we'll have some wide receivers. We'll see if some marks can fall at that point in time. But now they'll do the agility drills, the cone drill, that sort of thing, and then they'll do some one-on-ones, the running backs and the linebackers. Did you notice anything, just before I let you go, and we'll sign off for the moment, but the offensive line versus the defensive line, anything eye-popping in that session, the one-on-ones this morning?
You know, I always say that one-on-one pass rush drills, to me, are a drill that favors the defense. So I think anytime that the offense holds an advantage, I think that's really impressive for an offensive line group, and that was my feeling today. And admittedly, in terms of attendance of top prospects, there are more of the top O-line prospects here than there are some of the top defensive line guys. But you know, I mean, the Laval trio stood out. We know that those guys are, you know, because of the ability within that program to maximize their potential, and obviously sometimes the age of players coming out of CEGEP, that a lot of times those guys tend to be a little bit closer to playing at the CFL level, and I think all 3 Laval players demonstrated that today. I thought before tweaking his knee, and I hope it's not too serious, I thought Michael Couture from Simon Fraser University looked very, very good today. You know, a guy who, not the biggest lineman, but a guy who I think certainly could play center, possibly guard in the Canadian Football League, but technically very, very sound. I thought he looked really good during his one-on-one, so hopefully that knee injury that he suffered today isn't too serious. On the defensive side of the ball, you know, props to to my Western guy, Rupert Butcher, who I thought was a guy who, again, with some of the other top defensive linemen missing, I thought was a guy who took advantage of the opportunity to kind of step up and separate himself from the group a little bit.
It is a weekend about taking advantage of opportunities, and more opportunities to come. We're going to be back at noon Eastern to give you the wide receivers and the defensive backs as they do their best in the 40. I want to thank you very much, Dwayne Ford from TSN, a wealth of knowledge. Fantastic to have you sitting
thank you. It's my
beside
pleasure
me here for these 40s for the running backs and the linebackers, and it's always nice to see you, my friend, and enjoy
Likewise.
the rest of the combine. Okay.
Thanks, Don.
Dwayne Ford from TSN, and that'll wrap it up for this moment. As I mentioned, we'll be back for DBs and wide receivers as we continue with the 2016 CFL Combine presented by Adidas. Noon Eastern time for more 40s. Noon Eastern as we say so long for now from the bubble at Bloor in Devonshire on the campus of U of T in Toronto.